Well, here we are back in the Word and heading toward the end of the week. Hope you're being edified by your reading in 1 Corinthians. We're still in this section, chapter 14 today, where Paul is responding to questions that he's received from the church in Corinth. So the first 6 chapters were questions that or concerns that were sent to him from a group around Chloe. And now these are questions perhaps from the elders in the church, beginning in chapter 7 that he's addressing. And he is dealing with issues with regard to worship right now. He's going to transition in chapter 15, but he's talking about what happens when the church comes together. And what I've labeled this is prophecy builds the church, is the theme of this particular chapter, and it's contrasting two things, prophecy and tongues. So apparently the Corinthian church was really focused on these, and they were out of control, it seems, with regard to the use of what's called tongues, and Paul was promoting the use of prophecy. So before we go too far, we need to define what those things are. So prophecy, there's a kind of a range of opinion about what this means, not only in this chapter, but in the New Testament. Some people would say that the prophecy that Paul is talking about is just like the prophecy of the Old Testament, that you had people in the church, maybe they contend we still do, but at least at Corinthians' day, we had people in the church that were bringing brand new revelation from God that had not been heard before. Those were the prophets that were coming to the church. That's one option. Another option is that it's new revelation from God, but not quite like they were getting in the Old Testament. Paul, in this chapter, you'll see, says that the prophecies are supposed to be evaluated. So they're supposed to be determined, somehow evaluated. So people look at that and say, well, it's prophecy, but it wasn't inerrant and infallible. The church had to weigh it. The church had to look at it. So a different kind of prophecy coming into the New Testament. Some would look at prophecy as a reference to the speaking gifts as a whole. So teaching, preaching, prophesying. Paul would say, or some would say that there's these are speaking gifts, just a reference to speaking gifts as a whole. And others would limit it still further and say that the New Testament equivalent of prophecy, or what's meant by prophecy, is the preaching of God's Word. Primarily out of the Old Testament, of course, in the first century Corinthian church, but continuing today in preaching the whole counsel of God. I personally, you can hold one of those views and still be a good Christian, so we can disagree on those. My personal view tends toward more, these are speaking gifts. Most likely, I think it's the preaching of God's Word is what's in view here. There's also question about what are tongues. When Paul talks about tongues here, what is he talking about? Well, some would say that tongues are kind of an ecstatic language that are given to people in certain heightened spiritual states or heightened states of spiritual awareness or communion with God, that they get a special, what they would call perhaps a prayer language or an angelic language that allows them to speak directly to God. Be one way to look at that. Another is that it's a supernatural language, that this is a gift to speak a supernatural language, a tongue that both God and angels know, can be then interpreted by others as well. So it's a special spiritual language. Some people would refer to it as a kind of a prayer language or something like that. And then finally, the third view is that this tongues is a reference to human languages, the supernatural ability to speak human languages. That seems to be what happened when tongues are first introduced at the day of Pentecost. Tongues are also talked about in the book of Isaiah, and Paul is going to allude to that in these verses. But I would tend to see prophecy then as today's New Testament preaching, and tongues as equivalent to the supernatural ability to speak a language you haven't been trained in. So that's my view. We can disagree, but as we go through the New Testament, test your definition as I test mine and kind of evaluate what I'm looking at. So chapter 14 then, if we get into that, Paul is urging them. He begins by urging them to desire spiritual gifts, pursue love, desire spiritual gifts. These things go together really well. I was listening to someone teaching earlier today, and they talked about how love is to permeate what we do as spices permeate something we cook. So if we're cooking, say, chili or spaghetti, or you'd put spices in there, you can't separate the spices out, but the spices permeate the dish you're making. It's the same thing with spiritual gifts. They permeate everything we're doing. They permeate the activity. So Paul is saying, have love and pursue these spiritual gifts. Let love permeate the use of the spiritual gifts. And he moves right into that by saying that specifically certain gifts build up the church. And throughout this chapter, Paul is going to come back to gifts should be used to build up the church, and gifts, we should pursue gifts that build up the church. So that's what he's talking about in this first section here, verses 1 through 5. And then in 6 to 12, he says specifically in verse 12, he says, so with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church. So Paul's point here in verses 6 through 12 is that we need to be working to build up the church. Tongues don't do that. Tongues don't build up the church, according to Paul, unless, and there's a caveat, unless they are understood and translated. So if someone is in the church, or a whole group of people are in the church, and they're speaking French and Italian and German and Hungarian and English and Dutch, and you have this cacophony going on, it's not building up the church unless they're being translated, unless those languages are somehow communicating to people. So Paul says, I think in these verses, that revelation, knowledge, prophecy, teaching, these are the things that build up the church. These are the things that we should be striving for. And these are the things that we should be allowing love to permeate and direct our use of these things in the church. Verses 13 through 19, then, he transitions to a discussion about tongues. And he is careful to say that a language has got to be translated in order to be able to understand the message that is being communicated, as well as reap the benefits from that message. So Paul is not saying that tongues are forbidden. He is saying that tongues ought to be used properly, and that proper use involves the interpretation or translation of tongues. Paul himself claims to have spoken multiple languages, and certainly we can believe that, as his ministry spanned from Antioch in the east all the way to Rome, perhaps Spain in the west. We don't know about Spain for sure, but he had a desire to go there. So Paul, no doubt, was gifted to speak these languages. But he said even though he spoke those languages, he would rather speak words that would be understood by the church in order to edify the church. Verse 20 then, 20 to 25, he makes the point then, in contrast with the gift of tongues or languages, he is saying that the gift of prophecy And again, my view is it's the preaching and teaching of his word. The gifts of prophecy then build up the church and cause people to be saved. That's the message of 20 to 25. I like the way he begins here. He did this before. He says, brothers, do not be children in your thinking. Back in 12:1, he said something similar. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers, I do not want you to be uninformed. So again, he's telling them in my crude way, don't be dumb, right? Be sophisticated, have understanding, understand how these gifts are supposed to be used. And Paul is explaining that to them. So he's warning them, don't be stupid. Tongues are for unbelievers, he said. And he references Isaiah 29:11 and 12, where these foreign languages were going to be a sign to Israel of their coming judgment. And that's what he is making this equivalent to. Tongues are for unbelievers. That is what it's for. Prophecy, on the other hand, is believers, for believers. He said, if all speak in tongues, unbelievers would be repelled. But if all prophesy, unbelievers are going to hear correction, and it's going to result in their worship of God. In other words, that's going to result in their salvation. Verses 26 through 33 then emphasize the proper use of both tongues and prophecy in the church, and it's supposed to be in an orderly and controlled, purposeful manner, again, to build up, to edify, to educate the church. That's what it's supposed to be for. And the worship services Paul is emphasizing here in these verses are to be orderly. Not everyone is supposed to speak out, whether they're speaking a foreign language or whether they're explaining God's word and teaching it. They're supposed to be orderly there. That's going on there. Order in the church. Verses 33 through 34, we come to another difficult thing in the passage. Not only do we have to sort out what's he mean by prophecy, what's he mean by tongues, but he also says that women should be silent in the church. He says, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches. So again, some look at this and say this is a standard and universal prohibition for women speaking at all in the church. Paul tells them in this paragraph that if they have a question, they're supposed to go ask their husband. So some take it to mean that this is a universal prohibition for women speaking at all in the church. I would disagree with that and toss that out, mainly because just a few chapters earlier, in chapter 11, verse 5, Paul talked about women in the church who pray or prophesy. So if I'm getting prophecy right, you have women in the church who are praying out loud. You have women in the church who are declaring or explaining God's word out loud. That's happening in the church. And we know from, for example, in Titus 2, that women are to be teaching other women. So women have this prophetic role in the terms of teaching God's word to other women. So I don't think this is a universal exclusion of women speaking in the church at all. Another way to look at this is that this was with regard to certain and specific women who were causing problems, contributing to the disruption in the church in Corinth. I guess that's possible, but again, we don't seem to have clear evidence for that. That's a speculation, a reconstruction of a historical situation that frankly we don't know about. We can only read between the lines of this book. I think the best solution is that this is talking about women interpreting prophecy, that when there's a prophetic utterance being made, when there's preaching and teaching going on in the church, that women are primarily supposed to ask their husbands for an explanation. This doesn't exclude them from, again, if they're in a class with another woman, teaching that, or bringing up a question in a respectful way, but primarily he's talking about in the context of prophecy, that women are supposed to not be involved in that explanation and interpretation. And again, I think this goes with Paul's prohibition about women being teachers for the general church in 1 Timothy 2. So I think there's continuity there, and we'll talk about that more in 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. And he closes the chapter with the prohibition that those who recognize that this is from God will agree with Paul. So Paul is putting, and again, notice this, Paul is putting his teaching on the same level as revelation from God, revelation from the Spirit. He is saying that they will recognize that. So Paul is again asserting his apostolic authority here. Another example on my mind that the apostles knew that they were bringing new revelation from God to the church. He also ends on a note of being orderly in the church. And that's important, and Paul keeps coming back to that. Orderly, not because it needs to be somber or reverent, although I think it does, but I think Paul's main point here is orderly in the sense that everything should be oriented toward the building up, the strengthening of the local body. I pray, brothers and sisters, that you are in a church where we may disagree on prophecy, we may disagree on tongues, and we may disagree on the role of whether women can speak in the church, but may we all agree that the ministry of the church and the activities of the church are to build up, not to tear down, are to encourage and edify and educate. May that be what we are doing, contributing to, what you're individually contributing to in the church that you're in. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Friday's tomorrow, so we'll be looking at 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul's going to talk about probably the most, I wouldn't say probably, the most important thing in the New Testament is the gospel of salvation through Christ. God bless you.